Alright, here for these notes, we're going to finish up the road to Civil War. We're looking mostly at the year 1860. We're also going to real quick look at Lincoln's inauguration in 1861. Okay, so in 1860, by this point, we've gotten to this period in U.S. history where the South is threatening secession, and they had done this before. In the election of 1856, some Southerners had said, well, you know, if a Republican wins, we're going to secede because you guys don't like slavery. It wasn't every Southerner that was saying that. It wasn't really a mainstream belief, but there is some speculation that that's part of the thing that actually helped Democrats win in 1856, that Northerners felt that the South might actually secede, and so rather than run the risk of that happening, especially business interests, kind of pushed people to vote Democrat because they didn't want to lose the business connections with the South. By 1860, more and more Southerners are starting to discuss secession openly, and their biggest thing was if a Republican, if a supporter of abolition wins, then they would secede. And even though there were people in the North that were still afraid of it, there were still enough people in the North who kind of said, you know what, fine, you want to secede, we don't believe it's going to happen, but we're not willing to give in to you at the ballot box this time. Now, in the election of 1860, the Democrats are going to have problems. The Democratic Party split. Okay? Southerners and the Democratic Party demanded that the party in its official platform support the protection of slavery and support the expansion of slavery into the territories. The frontrunner for the Democrats getting the nomination is going to be Stephen Douglas, the guy that came up with the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Southerners don't trust him. They don't trust him after the Freeport Doctrine, which we talked about in class. That was the thing where he said territories could vote on the issue of slavery, and if a territory voted to be a free territory, then they could be. And that's where Southerners say Douglas doesn't support slavery enough. And so the Southern Democrats left. Northern Democrats went ahead, though, and they nominated Stephen Douglas for president. The Republicans, they nominated Abraham Lincoln, of course. We know Lincoln. He was nominated because even though he's an abolitionist, he is seen as a less radical abolitionist than William Seward, who had kind of been the presumed Republican nominee. Everyone kind of thought he was going to get the nomination, but he had made enough political enemies that he wasn't acceptable to some Republicans. Abraham Lincoln was kind of seen as a compromise choice. There's some other parties in the election of 1860. We've talked about the split in the Democrats, and the Southern Democrats, or when they left the Democratic Party, they went ahead and held their own convention. They refused to support Stephen Douglas, so they nominate their own candidate for president, this guy named John Breckinridge. And finally, there's a fourth political party. They called themselves the Constitutional Union Party, and they're going to nominate a guy named John Bell for president. Now, there are all kinds of issues in any campaign, and this campaign is no different. There were tariff issues, tax issues, foreign policy issues, but all we're going to focus on for this campaign was slavery, because that's what the Civil War was ultimately about. The Democrats, and we're talking about the Stephen Douglas Northern Democrats, their campaign focused on kind of continuing the use of Stephen Douglas's idea of popular sovereignty. Let the people in every territory decide. Let the people in each state decide. The national government should stay out of the slavery issue. And also following Supreme Court decisions. So they're going to stand behind the Dred Scott decision, which had invalidated the Missouri Compromise. The Southern Democrats, they, of course, campaigned to protect slavery, not only in the states where it existed, but they also wanted to protect its expansion into the territories. The Republicans, and this is important to note, the Republicans campaigned to stop the spread of slavery. Okay? They wanted to keep slavery out of the territories. They do not actually campaign on the abolition of slavery. They only campaign to stop its spread. There are plenty of Republicans that supported abolishing slavery and abolishing slavery everywhere immediately, but that was seen as a more radical view. They wanted to appear, at least, to be more moderate. And so they took what would be considered a more moderate stance, the idea that slavery can stay where it is, but we will not allow it to expand. And finally, the Constitutional Union Party, essentially, they figure out that if we don't figure out a way to agree, we are going to have civil war. And so the Constitutional Union Party's campaign was one of continued compromise, whatever it took to keep the Union together to prevent civil war. Okay, so the results of this election. With 4 people in the presidential election, you'd think maybe no one would gain an electoral majority, and that's kind of what a lot of people thought in 1860, but instead Lincoln won outright. This did not have to go to the House of Representatives. For those of you that are in my class, you do not have to write down these numbers that I'm fixing to show you. Okay, these are the vote totals. I'm not going to ask you about the numbers, but I have them up here because I want you to see something real quick. Hey, these are the vote totals for all 4 guys. Okay, and you have the popular vote in front, and then in parentheses the electoral vote. Lincoln wins outright with 180 electoral votes. He really only needed 152. Stephen Douglas came in second in the popular vote, but look, he only gets 12 electoral votes. John Breckinridge, the Southern Democrat, got 800,000 popular votes, only 72 electoral votes, and John Bell, with just over 500,000 popular votes, only gets 39 electoral votes. Okay? This map right here kind of shows you how everything broke down by state, and you see that Stephen Douglas wins Missouri outright, so he gets all those electoral votes. He also got 3 electoral votes actually from New Jersey. That's where those other 3 are coming from out here. Okay? Lincoln wins all the northern states, of course. Okay? Breckinridge wins all the southern states, and John Bell wins these. Okay? Remember, the electoral vote totals are based on population. Okay? And so these 3 big states right here account for John Bell's 39 votes. Look at the southern states, though. Okay? 4 in Texas, 4 in Arkansas, 3 in Florida. There just aren't that many people living down here. Okay? And so that's a problem. I like this map as well. Okay? The colors are basically exactly the same. The green still represents Breckinridge. The kind of orange-yellow still represents Bell. The blue, Stephen Douglas. And the red, Abraham Lincoln. Okay? And if we contrast it with our map that we can still kind of see down here at the bottom, okay, you notice kind of these bands. Okay? This band up here that supports Lincoln, as you get toward the middle, okay, more people supporting Douglas. Okay, here in the middle, you see the yellow for Bell, and then the green down here for Breckinridge. This, by the way, down here, this is an orange, and that's going to be a John Bell vote. Okay? And I wanted to point that out because the further north you went, the more likely you are to vote Republican. The further south you went, the more likely you are to vote Southern Democrat. But the thing about Lincoln's election is, in a lot of these states down here in the South, Lincoln's name didn't even show up on the ballot. And so that makes his win kind of even more impressive. Well, Lincoln's election leads South Carolina to decide to secede. South Carolina is going to hold the first secession convention, and on December 20th, 1860, South Carolina announces that they are going to secede. And their reasons for secession, we've talked, you've probably heard that, oh yeah, the Civil War was about more than slavery. Slavery was a minor issue. Well, let's look at South Carolina's grounds for secession. First of all, South Carolina says, look, the states need to have their own sovereignty. The states do need to be in charge of their own political destinies, but specifically, the states need to have sovereignty over the issue of slavery. Okay? The second reason for secession is the North has a pattern, a history of attacking the institution of slavery. Third, a purely sectional, regional political party has formed, one in the North, which only held power in the North, and because the North had more electoral votes and more population, therefore the North was going to dominate an area marked by abolitionists. And finally, the election of a president who is hostile to the institution of slavery. And I want to point those four things out because I want you to understand. As much as you may have heard about, well, the Civil War was actually about states' rights. The Civil War was about a state's right to allow slavery. Slavery is the driving force that causes the Civil War. It's not some revisionist thing where, it was, the states trying to stand up against an oppressive government that was oppressive in all things. They were doing this for future generations. It wasn't. It was about slavery. Okay? It's about slavery. Don't forget that. Within 2 months after South Carolina secedes, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas are also going to vote to secede by February of 1861. The president, at the beginning of 1861, is President Buchanan. He's a lame duck. The election happened. He knows he is not going to be president after March. And so even though he opposed the idea of secession and didn't think it was legal, he doesn't do anything to prevent it. He doesn't use force. He doesn't, he came out and spoke against secession, but then he didn't turn around and do anything about it, partly because he's done in March. What does he care? There are a couple of last-ditch efforts to prevent the Civil War and compromise. There is something that is proposed in Congress called the Crittenden Compromise. Okay. This one was, we would extend the Missouri Compromise line all the way to the Pacific. Okay. Everything below the line would be open to slavery. Okay. For slave owners who their slaves escaped, they were runaway slaves, and they were not captured, the national government would compensate the slave owners for the loss of the value of those slaves. And finally, part of the Crittenden Compromise was Congress would pass an amendment. We'd pass an amendment to the Constitution that would specifically protect slavery in the states where it existed forever until each of those states individually decided on their own to abolish it. There was some support for this in northern newspapers. There was some support for this in Congress. Lincoln, the president-elect, when he was told the plan, he publicly came out against it. And so when you have a heavy hitter like the president, the leader of the Republican Party, coming out against this plan, it lost its effort. However, there was an attempt in the House of Representatives to authorize an amendment that would protect slavery. It did get through the House. The state of Ohio did ratify that amendment. They're the only state that ratified that amendment, so of course it died. But that's just another attempt at compromise. There were also some northern states who, when they started to realize that this was a real thing, the southern states were seceding, some of the northern states decided to compromise by repealing their personal liberty laws. These were the laws that said a person living within those states could not be denied of their liberty, in other words, captured and taken back into slavery, unless they had committed an actual crime. That was the way that some of the northern states were trying to get around the fugitive slave law. And so some of these northern states say, well, maybe if we repeal these things, this will appease the South. But of course it wouldn't. Lincoln, in his inauguration in March of 1861, stood before the nation as he took the oath of office, and he stated a couple things. The main points in his inaugural address was that he did not believe he had the authority or the power to stop slavery where it already existed. So he's kind of telling the southern states, look, you are afraid I'm going to abolish slavery in your states. I don't have that power. That would have to be done by Congress, and that requires everyone to work together. I don't have that power. At the same time, he stated that there's no such thing as secession. Once you are a state in the Union, you are in the Union forever. And so all these states that think they have seceded really haven't. But then the third thing is he's not going to use force to make them stay in the Union. He's hoping they can talk about this and the southern states will just kind of come around to the idea of, okay, you're right, we didn't really secede, that's not possible. He's not going to use force to make them stay. He's going to let them come to this conclusion on their own. So he won't use force unless the South does first. The only way he will use force is if he is provoked, if the South does something first. And that's where we end. Next time, we will be talking about the Civil War and looking at the different aspects of it.